and entertained for the next sort of 30 minutes. We'll just see how it goes. Okay, so rules and regulation and resources around plantation and commercial forestry as we know it now. And I'm sorry, I can't read the room. I'd normally start by saying how many of you in the room have got more than 1 hectare of trees. And if you do, welcome to the world of forestry, because you are covered by our National Environmental Standards for Commercial Forestry. That is the base size. So anything less than 1 hectare, you do not come under the National Environmental Standards. Anything more than, you do. The source stems our regulation from the Resource Management Act, and from that our national policy statements, for example, the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management and the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. And then national environmental standards also come under the Resource Management Act. And there's quite a wide variety of these in New Zealand now. There's national environmental standards for fresh water, for electricity. Gosh, now my mind's gone blank. Anyway, there is about 12 national environmental standards. The NESCF, as I'm going to call it from now on, only covers certain forestry activities, and I'll come to that. And then the other place we therefore need to look to find out what rules are relevant is the Tasman Resource Management Plan. And there's one other act in New Zealand that's really important in our world, and that's the Heritage New Zealand Pūhere Taonga Act. And this protects our archaeological and cultural heritage. So those, the first 1, 2, 3, 4 things on that list all are Resource Management Act regulations, and then the Heritage New Zealand Pūhere Taonga Act is a standalone act itself. To help us navigate what we need to do and need to do well, there's a series of forest practice guides that have been developed to give effect to the NESCF. So that's to help people to actually meet the permitted activity standards. And these are available on the Forest Owners Association website. We follow the New Zealand Forest Road Engineering Manual, and associated with that there is also an operator's guide. So one has got a lot of text, the other has got a lot of pictures showing poor practice, but more importantly, good practice. And it's a really great visual tool to have. And these are also readily available and free to download on the website. If you just put that in your Google search, you'll find those. Recently, Te Ora Rākau, the Ministry of Forestry, has released a slash risk management handbook. This has only been around probably for about 3 months. So that is also worth getting a hold of and having a look through. And then finally, we have in New Zealand an environmental code of practice. It is, to be honest, quite out of date, but it is currently being reviewed by a working group of FOA members, of which I'm one, to bring it up to date and also to bring the forest practice guides under the umbrella of the New Zealand Environmental Code of Practice. So there's lots of good resources. So just go looking and you'll find them. So moving on to the NESCF, the scope is really important. So it applies to both plantation forests, so traditionally what we would have grown and clear-felled and replanted, but it also applies to exotic continuous cover forests, what we've traditionally called carbon forests. And both of these types of forests need to have been deliberately established for commercial purposes. So carbon foresters from 2023 must now plan how they will meet the environmental requirements for the different activities that happen on their sites. And there are also additional requirements for plantation forests compared to when the NESCF only used to be one for plantation forests. So the 2023 amendment brought carbon forestry into the regulation. So if we're looking at the regulation, there's a really important section called interpretation, and this section sets out the meaning of words that are in the Act. So if you're reading through it, and it is actually a relatively easy read, thank goodness, and you're not sure what the scope of the regulation means, it's really good to go back and look at the interpretation section because it tells you what has been envisaged. So in here, we find that exotic continuous cover forest means a forest that is deliberately established for commercial purposes, being at least 1 hectare of continuous forest cover of exotic forest species that has been planted and either won't be harvested, or it's intended that there may be some low intensity harvesting and that it be replanted. So you are allowed to do a little bit of harvesting. Whereas a plantation forest, again, deliberately established for commercial purposes, at least 1 hectare, and it's been planted and has or will be harvested or replanted. So those are the two key things that the regulation applies to. And you can see also when it talks about commercial forestry, which is both exotic continuous cover and plantation forestry, that it's everything to do with forestry infrastructure, but it doesn't include a shelter belt if it's less than 30 metres wide, forest species in urban areas, nurseries, seed orchards, trees grown for fruit or nuts, long-term ecological restoration, planting of indigenous forest species, or species used traditionally for soil conservation purposes. What is a really key distinction between exotic continuous cover forest and plantation forest is the clues in the name. Exotic continuous cover forest does not mean our native trees. So even if you've planted an area of indigenous vegetation for carbon, it does not come under the NESCF. Whereas a plantation forest can be both or either indigenous and introduced exotic tree species. The NES is based primarily on erosion susceptibility classification. So this classification has mapped throughout New Zealand, and it's identified low, medium, high, and very high risk areas of erosion. So if we're looking at the Motueka Catchment, you can see that there's a lot of orange, there's some red, there's some yellow, and there's some green. So it's got everything going on. But predominantly, the catchment is in yellow and green. But it's when we get into the separation point granites that it turns to orange. And so this erosion susceptibility classification is the base for the regulation that comes through in the NESCF. So different activities are allowed depending on what erosion susceptibility classification underlies the forest. So looking at a bit more about the NESCF, when does it start? It starts with afforestation, and the start of that is when you put a seedling in the ground. Anything you do up to that stage is covered by the Tasman Resource Management Plan. The other activities that the NESCF covers are pruning and thinning, earthworks, river crossings, forestry quarrying, harvesting, mechanical land prep, and replanting. The regulation also covers the installation of slash traps, a limited amount of Indigenous vegetation clearance and also non-Indigenous vegetation clearance, and also allows for discharges, disturbances, and diversions, which are traditionally things that would require consent or a rule in the plan to enable them to happen. It allows for noise and vibration, has controls on dust, covers Indigenous bird nesting, and also has rules for fuel storage and refueling. So this regulation covers those 8 core activities, but you're probably thinking it doesn't cover all of them, and you'd be right. It doesn't cover things like the removal of gravel from a riverbed or the spraying for Dothostroma. Those are covered under the Tasman Resource Management Plan. Council plans are also allowed to be more stringent than the NESCF. They're allowed to have tougher rules for where forests can be established. And it also says they're allowed more lenient rules as well, which is an interesting one. There is also more stringent rules on certain geologies, and our separation point granites have a specific carve out in the regulation so that the Tasman Resource Management Plan can take precedence over the NESCF. Also, council plans can be more stringent to give effect to the objectives of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, and also for 3 objectives in the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. The Tasman Resource Management Plan has got rules for afforestation within 50 metres of the coastal marine area. It's got rules around where you can plant close to viewpoints that are scheduled in the plan, landscape priority areas and surface water yield protection areas. Similarly, rules for replanting on those surface water yield protection areas and also groundwater recharge protection areas. Discharge of pesticides is also covered under the plan. And then when we move to our separation point granites, there's controls on earthworks, and there is also controls on some types of harvesting in the separation point granite. And that is a focus on ground base, where there is the most ground disturbance. Cable hauling can actually be permitted if you meet performance standards. Earthworks, if you're close to the coastal marine area, are also controlled by the Tasman Resource Management Plan, and as are river crossings if there's cultural heritage sites, and again in separation point granites. Looking back again at the NESCF, I've said that underlying the regulation is the erosion susceptibility classification. And you can see on the left-hand side column of the table, I've got several activities there that are covered by the regulation. And what I wanted to show by this slide was that there's certain things that are quite common throughout the different activities. And the first one is notice. So for an activity to be permitted, you must advise the Tasman District Council that you are going to do afforestation, quarrying, earthworks, river crossings, harvesting and replanting. You're not asking for their permission if you're meeting the performance standard. It is just a matter of providing notice to the council that that is your intended activity. And then they can choose whether they wish to monitor, which is the right-hand side. And under the regulation, they're allowed to monitor for those top 5 activities. And they're also allowed to charge you for the pleasure of coming out and monitoring how you're getting on as well. Back to notice. The amount of notice that you have to give is prescribed in the regulation. For example, it might say for afforestation, you must give at least 20 working days before you plant your first tree, and no more than 8 months prior to you planting your first tree. There's different time periods for each of those different activities. Many of the activities also require that a management plan is written for that activity, and the management plan covers off the environmental matters and impacts on community that need to be considered. Again, the management plan isn't something that the council approves, but it is something that you have to have written in accordance with the schedules for your activity to be permitted. You can't just ignore the requirement for a management plan. The council may also ask to see a copy of your management plan, and you must provide that within 5 days of being requested it. And it also must be in place before you start the activity that you're going to do. For afforestation and replanting, a wilding tree risk calculation is required, and there is a prescribed form for that in the regulation. And then you can see for most activities there, surprisingly not river crossings, that certain setbacks are required to be met. So they could be setbacks when you're talking about afforestation or replanting, setbacks from the public road, or setbacks from a dwelling, or setbacks from a watercourse, and the other activities have those similar things as well. What I thought I'd do now is just quickly go through the 8 activities covered by the NESCF, just to give you a feel for what it actually covers. And I've broken it down into the 4 classes of erosion susceptibility classification, with green being our most gentle land and red being our most susceptible to erosion, so it's our very high risk. So afforestation is the planting and growing of commercial forestry trees. So it does extend right throughout the life age of the tree before you go to harvest it, if you are harvesting it. And it also, if you've harvested an area of land and you've let it sit fallow for more than 5 years and you want to re-establish it again, that is covered by afforestation, not replanting, because there's a specific requirement that the harvesting must have been within 5 years for you to replant. And a key note here is it doesn't include vegetation clearance from the land before planting. So as I said, this starts when you put the first seedling or the tree in the ground. And so if we look across the erosion susceptibility classifications, generally it is saying that it is permitted in green, yellow, and orange if you meet the permitted activity standards in the regulations. However, if you're going to plant more than 2 hectares in red ESC, your activity would not be a permitted activity. If you can't meet the regulations, say for example, you wanted to plant within 30 metres of a dwelling for whatever reason, your activity then moves up and it would become a controlled activity, and you would have to get resource consent from the council, and the council can choose what types of conditions they may put on your afforestation. And then again, if you can't meet the base permitted activity regulations and your land is within an SNA or an outstanding natural feature or landscape, your activity becomes a restricted discretionary activity. And again, you need resource consent, and the council can choose whether to grant or not your resource consent, depending on the effects it's having on the values that have been identified as being important. Pruning and thinning is generally permitted across the board. Really, the only regulation in there that would kick you out from it being a permitted activity is if you put your pruning and thinned branches or tree into a watercourse and don't remove them. So the key thing there is keep it permitted and keep your slash out of water. For earthworks, what it is any disturbance of the land's surface by the movement, deposition, or removal of earth in relation to commercial forestry. So that distinguishes it from upgrading a farm track, for example, for farming purposes. However, if you're upgrading the farm track to enable you to start harvesting your forest, then that would come under earthworks under the NESCF. It doesn't include disturbance by machinery passes, forestry quarrying, or mechanical land prep. So if you are walking an excavator back and forward over the same path, but you haven't actually dug into the soil or done anything with any other type of machine, that is not called earthworks. It might still look like a track at the end of your operation, but it doesn't come under the earthwork regulations. Earthworks are a little bit different than the other activities under the NESCF in that they're broken down into 3 subcategories. So bulk earthworks is things like building skid sites and roads. Maintenance and upgrade, so that's if you've already got your existing infrastructure and it's ready to go, there's a level that you're allowed to do under that as a permitted activity. And road widening, sorry, that should be OR, not as in the mineral, but just the OR. So road widening or realignment. Generally, earthworks are permitted if you meet the regulations, and consent is generally required once you're on a slope greater than 25 degrees in the orange ESC and for all red ESC, regardless of slope. But don't forget that in the separation point granites, earthworks are controlled by the Tasman Resource Management Plan. For river crossings, there's various types of river crossings that are provided for under the NESCF. Single and double culverts, battery culverts, drift decks, fords, single span bridges, removable in-stream structures, and temporary river crossings as well. And they can be a temporary culvert or a temporary single span bridge. So the regulations are really prescriptive. They have requirements about how high off the riverbed your culvert is allowed to be, for example, for it to be a permitted activity. And once you get an embankment of greater than 3.5 metres, you would then need to get a resource consent from the council if that's the design of your single culvert. So you do need to have a look and understand what the restrictions are on those. And some of them have got restrictions on catchment size as well, and also on the velocity of the water that is passing through the river crossing that you install. Temporary river crossings are only allowed to be in place for up to 2 months. So they have a very limited shelf life. So if you've going to put in a temporary river crossing to enable access, and it doesn't need to be permanent, and it's going to be there for more than 2 months, really worthwhile giving Warren Galbraith at TDC a call and just chatting that through with him, so you don't get any unpleasant surprises, and he doesn't equally get any surprises either. Forestry quarrying is quite wide in its definition. So it's for the extraction of rock, sand, or gravel. It does not include overburden. So if you need to be moving overburden, it doesn't actually come under forestry quarrying. And it includes extraction of alluvial gravels outside of the bed of a river, extraction of minerals from borrow pits. So traditionally in the larger forestry company network, you might borrow a bit out of the bank of a road. Borrow pits these days are now covered by the NESCF, so it can trip you up. And it also includes the stockpiling of material at the forest quarry site. So key point, as I've already covered, it doesn't cover extraction of gravel from riverbeds or lakes or any other water body. So you can see there that there's, again, various levels of regulation. You can see when you're in the red ESC category, basically you need a resource consent to win any metal out of your property. And if you're working in the orange, there's various restrictions there. For example, you cannot get your gravel from a earth flow terrain. And then there's a definition about what that actually looks like. For harvesting includes the felling of trees, thinning trees, stems, and the extraction for sale or use, so production thinning, processing trees into logs, or loading logs onto trucks for the delivery to processing plants. And that's where it stops. So harvesting doesn't include the transport of logs to the customer. It stops when the logs are loaded onto the truck. It also doesn't include milling activities or processing, that should be of timber, or clearance of vegetation that is not commercial forestry. So again, it's quite limited. And there's various amounts of harvesting that is allowed depending on your erosion susceptibility classification. In general, once you get to red ESC, if you're going to be harvesting more than 2 hectares, you're going to need to get a resource consent from the council. And there is also within that ESC mapping, occasionally there's some bits that don't have a colour on it across New Zealand. And if you don't, then that also requires a resource consent. But generally, you'd be pretty hard pressed to be planting trees and growing trees in those locations. Most that I have seen have been in riverbeds. So trees don't tend to grow too well. For mechanical land prep, again, we look across the 4 erosion susceptibility classifications. Generally, it's pretty good in green, yellow, and orange if you're less than 25 degrees in slope in orange. And it's the same in the red ESC, and it's very clear that you should not be affecting the subsoil. So mechanical land preparation in itself is quite wide-ranging. It is preparing the land for replanting trees, including root raking, disking, ripping, roller crushing, clearing, slashing, mounting. But it doesn't include the creation of alternating drains and planting mounds using a V-shaped blade attached to the front of a bulldozer, which is something that you do not see very commonly these days at all. Replanting, the definition for that is the planting and growing of commercial forestry trees on land less than 5 years after harvesting has occurred. Replanting is a permitted activity if you meet the setbacks, for example, and the other requirements for replanting in the green, yellow, and orange ESC. But when you get to red, if you're replanting more than 2 hectares, you need to get resource consent from the council. So, resource consents, what you need to do to check. So, if you can't comply with one of the NESCF permitted activity regulations, then you're going to have to get a resource consent for that activity. So, it is a really good idea to aim to meet and comply with those permitted activity regulations. It's a far easier path in the regulatory world. You need to know if your activity is a controlled or a restricted discretionary activity. If it's a controlled activity, the council must grant your resource consent. If it's a restricted discretionary activity, the council can either approve or decline your resource consent application. And don't forget that, of course, that the TRMP may have more stringent rules for the 8 activities covered by the NESCF. The other comment I'd make here is a little note that I've got down the very bottom, which says beware of bundling. Bundling is when, for example, you have a controlled activity, which might be to put in a slash trap in a catchment less than 20 hectares, and you're also applying for a harvesting consent in red ESC, which makes it a restricted discretionary activity. By applying for both of those activities together, everything gets assessed at the highest level of restriction. So the controlled activity becomes a restricted discretionary activity. So just think about, if you're in the world of resource consent applications, what your activities are and whether you're better to apply for them together or apply for them separately. There is a everyday guide which is on the Ministry for the Environment's website about applying for resource consents. It's pretty generic, to be honest. You're probably better to get in touch with the council consents officer at TDC and ask for a bit of their time just to check that you're applying for the right resource consents that you need. There are alternate pathways to resource consents that are little known. Section 37 of the Resource Management Act gives the council the power to waive time constraints. So, for example, if you haven't given notice for the activity in the time period that's specified in the NESCF, you can actually apply under Section 37 for the council to waive that requirement, because the effects of the activity are going to be the same regardless of whether you gave 20 days working days notice or you were only able to give 10. So that is a really helpful section to know about. The other one that is incredibly helpful is Section 87BB, and this is for marginal or temporary non-compliance. And so if, again, an example of using, you only gave 10 days notice instead of 20 days notice, you can apply under this section as well, because essentially the non-compliance is temporary and the effects are very minor, and it's only a marginal move away from what was actually required. So you can use that one. And the other handy section in the Resource Management Act that I pull on occasionally is Section 133A. And this is when your resource consent has been granted and good practice is always to check your draft conditions. But if it's been granted and you go, oh no, there's a mistake, glaringly obvious mistake in there that's probably administrative, you can apply under this section for your consent to be reviewed without it having to be a formal review process and follow a more time-bound and costly pathway. I was also asked to cover off on environmental considerations. And this page looks incredibly overwhelming. But what I did was I went to the NESCF and looked at the matters of control and the matters of discretion and the regulations. And these are all things that need to be considered under the NES suite of activities. So yeah, some of the obvious ones that we think of are water quality, erosion, sedimentation, our impacts on ecosystems and outstanding freshwater bodies. But there's also a requirement that where there are Treaty of Waitangi settlements that include statutory acknowledgements, they have to be considered as well as part of our assessment of environmental effects. We need to think about, from an earthworks point of view, stability, spoil stability, diversion of water bodies, stabilising disturbed areas. We need to think about fish passage, fish spawning, maintenance of river crossings, making sure we're not resulting in aggradation of the riverbed or discharging contaminants into water such as concrete. So there is a significant amount of things to consider. We need to consider the impacts on our immediate environment, as well as the downstream receiving environment, which includes communities as well. And we also have responsibilities for Indigenous bird species that are nationally critical, endangered, or vulnerable. And then the regulation specifically talks about kiwi, karerea, our falcon, North Island weka, and quail. Not that that's a bird. So there is a lot to consider. So as Annette has said, this will be shared with you, and I apologise now for the typos that I can see in there on the big screen that I didn't pick up the other night. And that brings me to the end of what I had to cover. So I'll work out, stop sharing my screen. Here we go.
Right, does anybody have any questions?
I've got a couple, needless to say.
Yeah.
Very good. Thanks, Heather. That was really interesting. I've got Roger May here. A couple of questions. One of the conditions in the NESCF that relate to a number of the provisions in the NES is the constraint on sediment entering streams. And I'd like to know what your opinion is of the provision where it states that there shall be no conspicuous change in colour or visual clarity with reasonable mixing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say it's a very hard provision to meet, and different activities have got different standards regarding sediment. Underlying the NES is section 97, which is one of the regulations in relation to disturbances and discharges to the riverbed. And that says that if your activity, say for example harvesting, is a permitted activity, then you also have an allowable permitted discharge of sediment. But you are right, it still does need to meet the criteria that are there. So if we are thinking about what is the reasonable zone of mixing, the courts are very clear that it is 7 times the width of the stream. So if your stream is only 1 metre wide, you only have 7 metres in which to ensure you've got no conspicuous change of colour from your sediment discharge. So the focus really needs for us in our day-to-day work is about trying to minimise that disturbance of riparian zones and look for where we've got connectivity between disturbed areas and water bodies to minimise that opportunity for sediment to be discharging. I don't know if that helps, Roger.
Yeah. And my second question was, I understand that MPI or TUR are conducting yet another review of that NESCF, but only in relation to parts of section 6, which is all about stringency that councils can apply. Can you give us some background on the 2 issues that I understand MPI are dealing with, and that is relaxing stringency relating to fresh water and changes to slash management?
Okay, I'm possibly not the best informed person, but I understood that they are reviewing the regulation with regard to afforestation, where councils can be more stringent than the NESCF currently provides for. So they're wanting to pull that back a bit. So under the review last year, that came in. I also understand they are looking at the stringency around giving effect to objectives of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, but I have no further information on that. And I also understand that they're looking at the residual slash components of the NESCF under Regulation 69.5, because it currently covers all orange and red ESC, but it is a focus on slash mobilisation, which really isn't that relevant to Sandhill country in Northland, and also the pumice country in the central North Island. But those areas are both identified as red ESC because the underlying erosion can be significant if water is not controlled well, but they're not really the issue that we see in Tairāwhiti with tertiary mudstones, for example, and the mobilisation of slash.
So a lot of this is going to be familiar to those of you who are in it. Some people are going to know more than me because I'm not an ETS participant, so I've never gone through the process of working off the Tupuaki platform. So if there are questions about that, people, possibly Craig here and other landowners, are going to know more about that. So if we just step it through the whole thing, and just don't worry about the bits you already know about. And this is very basic because it's a really complex, multi-layered system where lots of things interact with each other. Once you do get your head into it, it's not too bad, but it takes a while. So this is an important date, the 1st of January 1990. It relates to the Kyoto Protocol. If you have a forest that existed before the 1st of January 1990, you are not really a participant in the ETS unless you harvest your forest, and then the rules apply to you. But what you cannot do is get ETS credits for forest that's there prior to 1990. This was like,
Susan,
yeah.
I'll just ask you to sit in front of the computer, please.
Oh, if I can see the screen from there.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Yes, I can. Does that mean I can operate it from here as well?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So yeah, so 1990 is the baseline. That's how much forest we had as at that date, and says this is how much New Zealand's got to meet its carbon commitments, carbon sequestration rates. After that, everything else is additional. So, I'm sorry, I just have to, nope. I've got to figure out how to change it. There we go. That's right. So, post 1989, you can plant a new forest under certain rules, which we'll get to in a minute. And that is considered additional. You don't have to enter that forest into the ETS, in which case then you're not under the rules of the ETS. but if you do, then you do. So if you harvest it, you've got obligations, and I'll get to that as well, because this is really relating to standard forestry. There's a new category in the ETS now as at January. So forest land is important to understand because not all trees is considered forest land. And this is important to understand both in terms of what was there as at 1990, and therefore whether you can plant a forest and that's new forest land, or whether the forest that you have is now forest land. So both what was there before and what comes after. So basically it's at least a hectare in size. The trees that grow on that hectare have got to be able to reach 5 metres at maturity. So you don't have to wait till your trees to become 5 metres to apply for eligibility. They have to ultimately be at least 5 metres high. That can be core trees, they don't have to be forestry trees. Those trees, once they are all grown, that canopy cover across that average hectare is at least 30 metres wide. So essentially you're really talking about 30% cover of a hectare, but yeah, 30 metres wide. Yep, it's not fruit and nut crops, not trees that are managed as an orchard, for instance, are not eligible. And then there are rules about how far apart trees need to be, like no more than 15 metres apart. And yeah, 30 metres on average. So you might sort of have bits joined up together, such, you've probably seen this diagram before, where you can take different, so if you have a farm and you've got different types of planting on your farm, so you might have, like, this could be like a wetland area and you've got some totara, well not totara, probably like pukatea and manuka and cabbage trees in there. That could be in the ETS, it's all over 5 metres high. It might adjoin to like a riparian section that may be less than 30 metres wide, but because it joins that in that total area, you'd have an average of 30 metres of 5 metre high trees, at least a hectare. And within that, you can have gaps of less than a hectare, which means that it allows for grazing within like a block. It's kind of like understanding those basic rules and then applying them to your site, of which people like Craig have to do a bit of. And then there are differences in the species or the types of forests you grow, which are aggregated into species, and then the way that the forest is managed. So it can be regenerating or planted native forest. So you don't have to have planted the forest, it can be a regenerated forest, provided it established after the 1st of January 1990. And then radiata pine has its own tables as to how much units are generated by a hectare of radiata pine, and that differs across the country. So that's the table that sits on its own and says in Marlborough, Tasman, this is how much you get, and that's different than you get in Wellington or Taranaki or something. There's Douglas fir has its own table, and then exotic softwoods or the rest of the softwoods are all aggregated together in one category, and then all the exotic hardwoods, regardless of species, are all aggregated in one category. You can have a forest made of mixes of these categories of trees, but it's the, you go with the forest that has the most density of that type of tree within the forest. And then when you've got your species there, it's like, is it going to be considered a standard forest or a permanent forest? And so permanent forest category came in January this year. And I'll just go through what those differences mean. Most of you will be familiar with standard forests. And to the carbon tables, this is like a little bit of an example of how the different categories stack up. So you can see they're quite different. Some things generate carbon quicker in the short term, but they go on for longer in the longer term. You see that hardwoods stop at the moment quite early on because that's considered the average age of a hardwood because it's based on eucalyptus nitens at the moment, not on like an oak tree or a chestnut tree or something. So it's just worth noting that the indigenous and the exotic hardwood categories are being re-measured at the moment. So don't know which way that will go.
Will the exotic hardwoods go past year 35?
Well, that's right. I don't know. Because I also am not sure what happens under the permanent category now. Like, do they stop it there? Because this is average, based on average age, right? which I'll show you what those average ages are in a bit.
Excuse me, I'm familiar with the terms stock change and averaging.
Yep.
But not standard forest.
Oh, I'll get to that. So standard
yeah.
forest is for forests that are harvested, as opposed to permanent forests, which are
Yes, I know.
remain.
Permanent.
Yeah, so when I talk about that, that's where the averaging accounting applies. So permanent forests, this is where things like native regeneration would be in permanent forests. A forest that you never need to completely harvest, but it doesn't have to be natives, it can be any species. At the moment, it can also be a permanent pine forest. That's it at the moment. So the forest has to remain unharvested, can't cut the trees down for 50 years. At the end of that, if you harvested it at that point, then you'd have the same rules as on standard forest, where you would have to surrender units or, replant. If it was a native forest, you probably wouldn't be able to do that anyway, because it would probably start to fall under rules under the RMA. And you can then, at the end of 50 years, put it in for another 25 years and another 25 years after that. You earn credits for as long as the forest grows, because you use stock change accounting, which is measuring the carbon in the forest. You can still harvest small areas out of a permanent forest, provided that you always retain a 30% canopy cover on average across a hectare. And you would surrender the units that are lost when you're doing your accounting. So you're accounting for your stock, you're saying I've taken 30%, therefore my stock has gone down. And then you either surrender the units or you wait for them to come back up before you start to then get units back again. So this is probably the one area where you don't have to have either carbon or timber, you could have both, just it'll be a balance. So that method sort of suits a high value alternative exotic that with coppice and a shade tolerant. Some species it doesn't work because they need a lot of sun or they don't work well in a continuous canopy system. And yes, if the management is appropriate, you can utilize it to have a long-term native sink to transition it across. Don't ask me what that means in terms of carbon units when you have the transition forestry model, because I don't think we quite know that yet.
I think it would, when the predominant species changes, so it takes some
it would drop,
changes from exotic to native, that's when you have to do
you drop and then wait for it to come up. Probably I think that's probably what will happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So
no.
But that's probably what would happen. So standard forestry is forests which are intended to be harvested. So you only get units on your first rotation. So you grow a pine forest, you harvest that forest, you can't get units the next time you plant that forest. And when you do harvest it, you have to either replant it, regenerate it, or surrender units. So this is the one that uses averaging accounting. So that's the average ages that are attributed to those categories. So you get units up to their age, and then that's it. So it's also that you can, in fact, take a standard forest and you can transfer it into the permanent forest category. So you've got an existing forest and you're intending to harvest it, and you can then make it a permanent forest. You can't go the other way around without paying penalties. So deforestation, it has a specific meaning under the ETS. So it doesn't just mean harvesting. So deforestation means that you've harvested your forest and you've changed the land use. So it's now going to be a farm or a subdivision. It's not going to have trees on it again. So if in that case, you would have to surrender most of your units that you had gained over that period of time. To avoid that, you've either got to replant or regenerate it by these timeframes for these types of species. So you could plant your pine forest, harvest your pine forest, get your timber, not have to surrender your units so long as you plant in a pine forest or other type of forest, doesn't matter what kind, but you wouldn't get any units for that. And there are responsibilities. It's not like you don't do anything. So this isn't all of the things that you have to do, but you do have to report on the carbon in your forest, either using the averaging or the stock change methods. It's usually like every 5 years. The end of the next period is December 2025. If you were, and then it goes to the next accounting period. If you were to become eligible into the ETS in the next year before December 2025, you can count your units back to the last reporting period in 2023, I think it was. But if you wait till 2026, you can only go back to December 2025. So there are those periods you can report, you can make a return in between those times if you want to then, accrue your units, but you have to do it at least at those periods of time. You've got to keep records of your management, the carbon, like through stock change method, how much it's gaining, how much it's losing. If things change, so the rules, the obligations that go with the forest stay with the land. So if you sell the forest, sell your land, those obligations stay with the land. And it's something to be aware of if you're purchasing land, because sometimes people are looking at a piece of land and it's recently been harvested, they buy that land, they can't then plant it and get credits, or they may actually have the obligation to do the replanting that wasn't met by the previous landowner. So remembering that it stays with the land, and where things are subdivided, you may then end up like cutting through a carbon unit and it no longer is in the ETS. So you have to let MPI know all those sorts of things. Mine's a very quick presentation because it's not really what we're here for, but so the Forest Advisory Service, we can provide information around the ETS at a landowner level, whether you have got forest in the ETS or you're wanting to put land into the ETS or you want to plant trees. So we can provide that advice. It's all free advice. We don't give financial advice. That's a bit to which you'd step over into a carbon account manager or somebody who can do all that stuff for you. The regulations that we administer, which is essentially the Forest Act for milling, the ETS and the NESCF. Advice on species, forest health, security and fire. We have only me here in this region, but there is 13, 14 of us across the country. So while my knowledge is more in native forests, we have a range of people across the country. You got Dean Satchell, who's one of your farm forestry people. He's one of our team members. So we've got that knowledge amongst us. And we're part of that integrated advisory service with on-farm support and Māori agribusiness. So I have some cards. If anyone has like specific things they want to know about their property, their what they're wanting to do, but otherwise, in terms of any questions, there's lots more to it than this, but it's a start. No, Roger?
Yeah, I've got a question. Well, no, it's not a question, actually.
A kind of question?
Yeah, no, it's not a question. I think the point you raised about advising MPI if you change, if the ownership changes, is that the other side of that coin is that if you're buying a property, you need to ask if it's any of it is in the ETS or not.
Yeah, it should be on your title.
Yeah. So the lawyer should know.
Yeah. And
should tell you that there's ETS in it. The other thing is that if it's been harvested, well, actually, irrespective of being harvested, if they receive credits, then there is a potential liability down the line. And so the value of those credits needs to be taken into account when the buyer and the seller are negotiating price. And that not all lawyers pick that up.
Or real estate agents.
Or
if they do, they might not pass it on. So that is a trap, especially we do have people ask us, we're looking at this piece of land, what are my liabilities? So I'm not sure how many people never ask that question. But yeah, it is.
Because like you say, it goes with the land.
Yeah.
It seems to me when you own a forest, you can own three things: carbon credits, logs at harvest, and the value of the land. But you can't add those three together to see how rich you are.
No.
Because if you harvest the trees, you've got to go up the credits.
That's right, and I think that's things people don't always understand. Like you do hear people say the ETS, it's like, oh, you just grow this forest and you cut it all down again and you're given all these credits. Or you don't keep those credits, of course. It's you know, unless you replant forest. So the forest actually becomes permanent in a way, not the same forest, but forest land. So
That's under Aboriginal.
well, under
Under stock change,
yeah.
you've got this catastrophic loss, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
And it seems to me that, you know, stock change, if you can be a bit like permanent forest, you can grow the trees on for, say, you're growing for 45 years and you're doing pretty well on the carbon credits and you're selling them all and living on the high. Then you get catastrophic loss, you know, fire and throw. You can do a salvage harvest, but you've got to wait like 45 years before there's any more income. The trees grow back.
Until they grow back.
And meanwhile, you're paying this $14 a hectare, aren't you? You're going to come and
Well, they're being
bust the
reviewed.
rates.
The fee right now, there's a fees review. So it's open, I think it's open for
Well, it was
consultation.
$30 and now they're reviewing
14.
it down to 14.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still open.
Still
Yeah,
open.
so it's like, and when there are these consultations, like when it comes back to looking at space poplars, which was consulted on before the last government, it will come up again. It's an opportunity to provide information and advice on what you think is options, because you might, as foresters, have options or ideas that have not necessarily been considered. So they are worth submitting, you know, what you think as a forester on these things.
Could you go back to your slide where it gave the numbers for the different species types?
Sorry, I'm on to Craig's one now.
Oh,
How does it,
I don't do that.
how do I go back? Can you go back off your? No,
No, I don't go forward.
it seems to only go forward.
I think with the arrows you can go backwards and
Oh,
forwards
hang on,
on the
there it is,
keyboard.
it's hidden under something
Oh,
else.
no,
I
no.
think.
If you use the mouse, you can go.
Yeah, I am using the mouse. Oh, there we are. Sorry, it's kind of hidden under that thing there.
So
Sorry.
the 30 square meters, remember?
That
we
one?
discussed that?
Yeah.
These are the
Yeah,
lookout
What's
tables.
really important to note there
No,
is the difference between exotic hardwoods, even in year 20, compared to Marlborough, Nelson, Radiata.
Yep.
Yeah.
And if you choose to plant something other than Radiata, you can plant hardwoods. At the moment, the table runs out at year 35, so we've got to do something about that in the next year.
Because as I say, it's been measured on nitin, so they say, well, that's the age to maturity.
Yeah, so that covers things like oaks and eucalypts and wattles and a whole range of things with leaves. But what you can do there is if you put your area into exotic hardwoods and into permanent forests, you can get, and you're under 100 hectares, so that means you use the default tables, which is what those numbers are based on, then you don't have to plant the high density of seedlings per hectare, because you only have to get 30% canopy cover.
That's right.
And oaks and eucalypts can be like 14 meters across in their canopy at maturity, in which case you can plant really low stockings like 200 a hectare instead of 800 and still be eligible and still be getting 526 tons of credits per hectare at year 20.
I was looking at there and thinking you can still graze under those trees.
Yeah.
You know, you can plant trees, you can still graze, depending on, I don't know how it works. Eucalyptus would work very well, but you can still graze under a light hardwood.
Well, not only that, you could actually underplant with natives.
Yeah, for to transition.
And there's sufficient light under there compared to a conifer, and ultimately transition your exotic hardwoods to native.
Yeah. So
And get good carbon.
yeah, I think it's about looking at what you're saying, the use of the tables, noting that with permanent forest you are using stock change, not averaging accounting.
Right.
So you're going to keep measuring it as it grows, and if it keeps growing, then presumably you keep getting credits. But also using those mapping rules. So how can you take your land and take that bit of forest and join it up to that shelter belt and that bit of stream and then with the odd extra planting just to join up the gaps to optimize how much land you're going to have in the use. So it takes a bit of careful
that's
mapping.
allowed, so because I remember we had discussion in the area or something, and we thought that 30 square meters was the minimum width,
On average.
but it's the average.
It's average.
30 meters.
30 meters, 30
Yeah, 30
meters on
meters.
average.
Minimum width.
minimum width.
But it's average.
It's average. So, I can't do this going back.
Yeah, so that means all the different blocks here, we potentially could join it together.
Provided there's no
And
more
make
than
one big
15
photo.
metres between, the
Yeah.
15-metre rule has to apply. So if you've got a narrow shelf out,
Yeah,
and then you've got a gap, you can put, say, a poplar or another tree there, and then, but you've got a bigger area, so like there's that gully up there,
Yeah.
if that was in there, then on the average of that area will be at least 30 metres. So you're gonna have some much bigger areas to be able to have this
to
like. narrow
compensate
area.
for the,
Yeah.
yeah, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, so when you're mapping your forest, you have to end up producing some map files as part of the application to join. When you're mapping your forest and it's young, what you have to do is imagine what the canopy sizes of the trees will be at maturity. And the rule is that you've got to, when you're mapping the edge of your forest, you've got to hit a canopy, a future canopy, every 15 metres. So, but it can't go outside your property boundary.
No, it's got to stay within your boundary.
So there are ways to optimise your mapped area and therefore your carbon by thinking about how the trees can grow.
And I'd go for like Yunnan poplars, not like Lombardy poplars, because the bigger your crown cover, the less trees you're going to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, Susan, just following on from that 15-metre spacing, is that branch tip to branch tip?
Canopy edge to canopy edge, not trunk to trunk.
So if I plant a paddock, I want to keep grazing it. So I've got 15 metre to 15 metre. So I read somewhere where the poplar spacing, if I was to plant poplars, the spacing might be different.
You mean when we did the space plant, because we're looking at having space planted poplars in the ETS as a separate category? Is that what you, but that didn't progress past the consultation phase. It's probably likely to come back on the table next year. And so that will be a different stocking rate than that. So that's probably where it will be a bit of a game changer for a lot of farmers.
Sorry, so
at the moment it would fall into that hardwoods category, and it would just, all the other rules of the ETS would apply. Last year they were looking at saying, well, if you could put space poplars, and they were only looking at poplars, which is I think one of Eric's questions when it came out, they were only looking at poplars, not other trees. But if you use them for space planting for erosion control, they would be wider than that, because you've got to still allow grazing, but it could be in the ETS. So MPI went out to consultation on that to then see about having it in the regulation, and then that stopped because there was a change of government. So we don't know what's going to happen with that, but it may come back on the table to then think about it again and have it in the ETS.
So that's all up in the air at the moment?
It's all up in the air at the moment until, well, you can have poplars, they just would be in the the hardwoods category. They wouldn't be a separate category of space planted poplars. So it's more about the like establishment method, stocking numbers, not the species, but the management of the trees. So space planted. So at the moment, don't know, maybe it'll come back next year, I think.
So even with poplars now, it's still that 15-metre branch to branch?
Yeah, because it's just same as every other, but which is maybe a little bit close if you were farming.
Okay.
So we probably need to move on to you. But I have got cards. If you've got specific questions, I can just follow up specifically on those.
Hi everyone, I'm Craig McMiken. I'm the Regional Manager for the Forest Management Group. So what I'm going to talk about just briefly is when we're talking about carbon versus timber, we're talking specifically about when we're looking at harvesting a woodlot. It's not the wider context of that ETS. We could talk about the ETS all night. There's so many bits to it. So
still not understanding.
yeah. So what we're so when a forest owner is coming up to look at harvest, if their forest is entered in the ETS under stock change, there needs to be a comparison in a lot of cases of the value of harvesting that forest, and then and then surrendering the credits, replanting another forest, versus in some situations, the alternative of growing that forest and just getting a revenue out of carbon. Or in a lot of situations, it's a situation where the forest might be feasibly difficult or economically challenging to harvest. So it might be part of that forest. So you might have a situation where you've got a forest like the gentleman was talking about over here, where it's entered in the ETS under stock change, and you're weighing up whether you should harvest the whole stand or whether there's a potential to get a better long-term return by leaving some of it, growing it on as carbon, or potentially in some scenarios, and I've chosen a picture of the Marlborough Sounds where it's, you know, it's going to be very, very difficult in the future to harvest your forest in the Marlborough Sounds at a profit, or in a way that the environmental risk is at an acceptable level. That this particular forest here is pre-1990 forest land, so there's no opportunity to.
There's nobody there. And she's just saying, oh, yeah, well, I was going to come down at 7:15. I said, oh, look, don't worry about it. I'll come back. I'll find someone to start in the morning. And she's not, yeah, well, there's nobody there. I'll come down now because she's on putting the covers on. So I'll come down now and it's fun, and you put covers on there. So I said, oh, well, I'll do like it. And Gabby's daughter.
Are you the host here?
Yep.
So you can mute all other participants.
And I said,
Right. Well done. Yeah.
So this particular forest here, it's pre-1990 forest land, so there's no opportunity here to let that forest grow on and earn carbon. But where a forest is entered under stock change, there is the ability in a scenario like that to just grow that forest on, leave it in stock change and earn carbon. If you're in stock change, having the flexibility of leaving it in stock change is a good thing. So don't convert it over to the new permanent category, just leave it in stock change. So you've potentially, on what happens with the price of carbon or the price of timber, you've still got options in the future. So the other scenario is where you've got, we've had a couple over the last couple of years where we've got post-89 forest, so that is eligible for the ETS, hasn't been entered in the ETS, but when we've assessed it for harvesting, there's areas of that forest that are physically not able to be harvested. So what we've done in that situation is we've entered it in the ETS, and so we've set up the different carbon accounting areas so that that area will carry on and earn carbon, the area that can't be harvested. So certainly a better scenario for that landowner than when when they actually planted those forests with the ETS. So what's required in these situations is a comparison of the future returns from carbon compared to timber. So how do we do this? We're running a cash flow, so an estimate of cash flow over a period of time. Often we'll run it over 50 years, which is starting to get out there when you come talking about what's the carbon price doing, what's this going to happen. But you've got to, with these sort of things, you've got to try to put some sort of analysis to it. So often the scenario will be comparing not harvesting and just earning carbon versus the second scenario of often if you've got a stand that's entered in the ETS under stock change, the scenario might be to harvest that forest, even if it's it would potentially look to be a better return to just grow it on carbon. But what that then enables you to do is earn carbon on the second rotation. So when you're looking at radiata with some of the potential for wind throw risk, you could look at changing the species to another more wind firm species, or you could look at growing another. For example, you could take a approach of growing another stand of radiata, but you're in two markets. So if the timber price, goes where some of us hope it'll go and demand keeps creeping up, then you can harvest that as conventional forest, but you still got that option. If the carbon price takes off and carries on for a long period of time, you still got the option of not harvesting that second rotation. And then versus timber only. So in that situation, if you're under stock change, which is what I'm talking about here, because what Susan was talking about is the current rules of the ETS, where we've got averaging and permanent. But most of you, if you've got forests, you would have entered them previously, so you're working under the original rules.
Probably worthwhile mentioning that permanent and the old stock change system, the calculations are the same. The biggest difference is between averaging and stock change.
Yeah. So
of stock change.
yeah, so I mean that's like, I think that is correct, but probably the point I was trying to make before is if you've got your forest and stock change, you've got all the benefits of having it in permanent, but you've got flexibility. That's one of the rules you've got. So I won't get into the details of some of the differences. People can talk to me afterwards if you want to know more about some of the details of ETS. I'll just focus on what we're talking about here, which is looking at assessing harvesting and woodlot. So what we do with those cash flows is then bring everything back to net present value, so to today, and that gives you basically you're able to assess which will provide the best return given the inputs you put in. So that old saying about something in, something out is very true with this. If you've got to do some sensitivity analysis particularly around the carbon price, because that's it's a very immature market. It's had a lot of volatility, and as we've seen, we've probably never seen something that can be so easily politically influenced. Like we've had, and so you don't want to. There's been probably people that have made investment decisions on a carbon price that is certainly considerably higher than what we've got today. So you want to be sort of looking at a few bit of sensitivity analysis around that carbon price. So the other thing I just mentioned is, we can do the numbers on it and we can outline, well, this, based on these set of inputs, will give you, all things being equal, a better return. But there's other things to take into account. Like, for example, a lot of situations, it's like a lot of things in life, it's more than just the money. Do you want to grow that particular species of trees on knowing that you're going to have issues with trees blowing over down the track? Having a solid plan of what's going to happen when we start getting wind blow, for example. And so what I mean, can that stand? Can you get in there and do some salvage logging? What would you like to leave behind when you're, to your kids or whatever? So it's not all about money. But some of it is about the money. So it's a bit of both. So that's really just a brief sort of section on that sort of comparison. So has anyone got any sort of questions on that?
Well, a couple of quick observations. One strategy might be to just go for stock change, carbon credit, carbon forest until you get a wind throw, and then do the salvage harvest. You don't have to surrender your credits in that case, But you've got to remanage the forest to replant and so on. But it may be that you're looking ahead at a long time before you're going to get any more carbon credits. It's going to be expensive to probably replant the forest. The land may not be very valuable, but what's the thing of just walking away, just sort of abandoning the land? You know, you're giving up on the rates, you've got to pay the $14 a hectare forever, and it'll keep going up. You've thought of that idea?
Well, yeah, there's people who are managing their forests basically as carbon forests, but on windthrow. So they're basically growing those forests on, and then when they get windthrow of a certain size, you know, they'll salvage log it and replant it. The difficult thing, you know, when you look around a lot of these hills around the Mott Valley, and they're really hard, as you're probably well aware, you know, like salvaging in steep country is difficult. Where you've got flatter rolling country and you can do things with ground-based equipment, it's a lot easier. So it's, and the question you say, I mean, that's a concern a lot of us have got. You know, particularly when we're talking about stuff with such the decisions we make today, planting forests, have got really long-term implications. So, you know, and I think we've sort of had the sort of horses bolt a little bit, like in that regard. And so there's a lot of concerns from not just other people, a lot of concern from forestry people on some of those long-term implications of, you know, people just walking off the land. You know, if the price of carbon drops away to nothing, and you've got a permanent forest, and you know, you've still got rates to pay, you've still got.
You've got forests that are sort of closing in on harvesting. Sort of, yeah, do there. And how many have you got forests overall? Probably most of you. Yeah. How many of those are pine? Half. A few other species, Douglas fir, eucalypts, cypress. So a bit of a mix. On the whole. That's good. Redwoods, yeah. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. Probably not in that near harvesting sort of front though. No. So probably harvesting's not really the fun word at the moment in forestry. You put it that way. But it is a pretty important part of the industry, and has been for a long time. So just to start, sort of run through harvest management. What does it mean? So there's a lot to it. A lot probably people don't realise. I might just grab a seat. It's easy with this mouse. But basically, it's turning these things here, known as trees, into these things, logs, deliver on truck to, in this case, it's going over the wharf, but to mill. So everything that's involved from getting a tree from the hillside to destination. Sounds easy, but really the reality is there's a lot to it, and a lot can go wrong along the way. So I'll break it down. So how exactly? So starting with planning, determining how you're going to get the trees off the hillside, where they're going to go. There's a few points along the way. So planning, helpful to start with inventory. So pretty key part of selling your forest in the first instance is knowing what you actually have there, because if you don't know what you've got, how can you then approach the market to say, I would like to sell you this? So another key reason, contractor rate setting and giving you the value of the forest prior to beginning, which is pretty key decision-making sort of point. If you don't know what the value is of your resource, then there's no point in trying to sell it. Or it might sort of give you some points on timing. And with introducing carbon, again, that creates more complexity. Planning health and safety. So one big thing is, can this operation be completed safely? One of the big questions we ask ourselves is, whether it can be done, and then partly whether it should be done. So the likes of this situation here, we did get that piece on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, there's now a tuft of trees standing at the top of the hill, because you just can't get there. And you've got to make these decisions. You've got to look at the ground, look at what's available and what you can do, There's a lot we can do with machines, but there's a lot that can't be done at the same time. So Heather touched on it, but environmental considerations. So in the likes of this instance, those trees there need to be processed somewhere to be taken to market. In this case, it's over the other side of that stream there. It's the only flat spot that we've got. So we've got a landing there that's available. So we're going to cross that stream, but there's obviously restrictions and regulations that are involved with that. So pretty important consideration when planning. But if we didn't do that, potentially we've got to put in more infrastructure, more cost, less profit. Planning, mapping, so quite key to have good quality maps prior to starting. Spatial information is important, and all of you should know that as forest owners, because you've got to know what's where and what it means. Other considerations, one thing about small forest harvest, and that's predominantly what we work with. Every single one of them seems to have those tall metal things running through the middle of them, which causes issues with felling and extraction and everything else. So we've got pretty good working relationships with like Network Tasman, Ventia, and all the lines companies, but it's a consideration of how much extra is it going to cost because of that. Fences, again, small woodlots, forests all have fences around them. Trees and fences don't agree. So it's just another cost that's potentially going to be incurred, or another thing that you've got to consider during harvest. Stock, noise. If you're close to anyone in particular, Heather talked about the NES. There's provisions for noise in that, and at the worst, they can hold you to 7 a.m. starting till 9 p.m. at night. So in many cases, truck drivers are wanting to cart for 13 hours of the day, 14 hours of the day at max. But you can't do that. You can't get those hours in unless you're starting early morning, 7 o'clock. You could be restricted to that. So the point is that there's a lot to plan for in forest, a lot to think about, and yeah, a lot to think about along the way. As part of that planning, thinking about engineering and infrastructure, pretty important for forestry. It's the one thing when planning private woodlots or small forests that is the potential to blow out. Second rotation forest is a little bit easier, but even if you've got a road, doesn't mean it's suitable. Lots of logging units now, whereas once they were 3 axle trailers, they're 5 axle trailers. Turning circle on it is much larger, so you can't necessarily use that infrastructure for the same purpose it was used for prior.
Were you saying the skids blow out or the money blows out?
The money,
Right.
because the cost of completing engineering, particularly under some of the new rules and regulations, is just continuing to push out. So if there's one thing that's really quite hard to estimate, it's generally engineering, because you don't know what you're going to get on the day. If you're in the middle of summer, fine, you might be okay, but outside of that, it can cause some issues. So important to think about road skid type construction, contract management. Key considerations for engineering topography. Obviously, steeper hillsides will mean more expensive roads. And to go on the back of what Heather talked about, different regulations under the NES will require different engineering practices. So on flat land, you can sidecast, just push material out. Steep land, you'll have to cart everything, all your spill away from site. So digger onto truck, cart into a flat area. Obviously, the cost difference between those two is substantial. So you could go from in the $30,000-$40,000, a very cheap sort of road, a kilometre, up to $150,000-$200,000 I've heard if you push up to the Gisborne region, Tairāwhiti, because they just don't have, they've got difficult country and they don't have any rock material in that area. So geology is important to think about. Obviously, within this catchment, we've got a multitude of different types of soil types. So you go right into the headwaters, Eastern Hill Country is rotten rock, relatively easy to build in, but there's lots of clay country as well, which packs in the wet. and then there's the granites, which are another story altogether. So the requirement of the road, so realistically that can change between forests. As an example, if you're planning on forestry for multiple rotations, that's great. But if you put too much work into the infrastructure, then that's just taken away from your bottom line at the end of the day. One sort of thing that does get said is that you want the road almost to fail as the last truck's driving off it. because if you're doing too much more than that and the road doesn't fail, then potentially you put too much effort into it, because the reality is you don't need it in that state that you need log trucks on it for another 27, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on what species you replant in. So if you over-capitalise on that, then you're taking away from your bottom line. So it's important to think about the requirement of the road, particularly in a small woodlot situation. That might be different for small-scale forest owners, because oftentimes the road can serve another purpose. And the other thing to think about is the existing infrastructure, as mentioned, the suitability of that to be used for your logging. So one consideration I've got here, I've actually flipped this map upside down just for ease because I've got another photo, but the road that we've got here, mouse, but we're coming in here off the seal at that skid one there. There was an alternative entrance down in the north here, down this bottom end, that we didn't use, and you can see that black dotted track along the bottom. That was an old track put in with the dozer that was good enough for access, but in reality it wasn't actually good to be used. And so when the forest owner first approached us about the job, he said, "Oh no, it's all good, we've got a road through there." But then as soon as we assessed it, we said, "Well, no, you don't, because actually that country down the bottom there with 3 crossings in it, and it's quite steep down the bottom of the gully, to do anything further in there, you need to in-cart all that material away." Whereas what we ended up doing was coming in from the bottom, putting in a new road altogether, but at a much reduced cost, because of the terrain that we were working in, the type of soil, we could do that a lot cheaper without needing any crossings. So
Is that your red one?
So the red one, yeah, versus the black dotted line. So when we look at that in practice, that's what we get. So you can see along the bottom there's the old dozer sort of track punched in, and suitable for a farm track, suitable for a road for 10 months of the year outside of the depths of winter, but not suitable for logging trucks, not suitable for upgrading without significant cost. So we go to the top road there, quite easy to put in, obviously all through farmland to reach the forest, but he owns that as well. But quite easy, didn't need to pull stumps out, he could just push that. The terrain made it really easy to push that in with the dozer quite quickly. So
Was that Moogly gravel? Is that around here?
that's in granites, so that's in the Standard Brook. Yeah.
No.
So that was under resource consent, which is fine, but it's just a consideration to have, that maybe the infrastructure that you've currently got in place, it could be suitable, but there's a chance that it might not be once it's upgraded for log trucks as well. And so here's just another example of, not necessarily in this catchment, but there's some of the issues you can have. So this is actually upgrade of old road, but the upgrade is from track to a trucking road, which is substantial regardless. If you look at the sub base there, it's all clay. So it has absolutely no guts to it at all. We're fortunate in this particular forest that we've managed to find in just borrowing some material a suitable area to produce a quarry. And so we've pulled this material here out, but in some cases you just don't have that availability. If you look at many of the different places within the region, if you're looking for good metal, it's not really available. Taylor's contract just started crushing in around Tapawera. So you can get material there, but otherwise you're sort of limited for where you can get any material from. So you're carting material a long way in to then put it on your roads. Costs obviously increase significantly for that. So it's one thing to think about how much infrastructure you actually want to put on site. If you've got material that's handy, or you can pull it out of the bank itself, easy. But if you don't, you have to think about, okay, what's the benefit of us building this infrastructure versus actually just putting more effort into the logging. So moving on, harvesting. So I haven't actually said much about harvesting itself because I kind of mentioned in the forefront, probably the operations are some of the easiest parts. We've got pretty lucky now that for the most part, the crews are pretty slick in the region. They've been working a long time and constantly improving. Everything's done relatively with machines. Sort of talking on a larger scale here, just as a sort of forefront, but things go well. It's more about the planning. So if you put poor planning in place, a poor harvest plan in front of a crew, they're going to do badly. But if you plan it well, you know how everything's going to work, then the operation should run pretty smooth. So some of the considerations of that. So harvesting methods often dictated by topography. Flat ground, easy, you can use ground-based methods. As you get into hill country, you're using cable yarding methods. But again, within this one particular catchment, there's a multitude of different types of topography. So some of the easy sort of country through here, simple sort of logging. But you get into some of the granite country where you've got quite a lot of broken areas. That's really difficult. So methods can be dictated by that. The big point about the different methods and different configurations and pieces of machinery that are used is that what you use will dictate how much you can produce. How much you can produce will dictate your cost. So better production equals lower cost. It's almost a direct linear relationship. More production, more cost. You can cause other issues having better production down the track in terms of your log sales. So Craig might have the same sort of thing from time to time that crews produce too much and you can't sell it, say, or you can't sell it to the right place because of the different products you've got to sell. But generally, that's a standard rule of thumb. And utilising reputable contractors. So quite important part of harvesting is doing that. There are a few cowboys out there that give the industry a bad name. I mean, even like, no, nothing's ever perfect. Nothing ever goes exactly to plan, but it's how you respond to that is important. So you don't want to sweep that under the rug. You want to bring in your compliance officers and look for the next option once things go bad. But yeah, generally, we've got pretty good contractors around here. So,
Could you
yes,
give us a bit of an indication how logging costs have gone over the last 10 years and what the trend is? I bet you it's not down.
North, yeah. Prior to the market's been in a real downturn for the last couple of years. Or I'll show you some graphs in a second that'll sort of illustrate that a little bit. But things were coming up quite steadily. And cost over the last couple of years because people are just trying to keep them work, trying to keep the wheels turning. Contractors have been in a situation where they've had to go, what can we cut out? What can we be better at taking out of it? Because otherwise jobs just won't get across the line when the market's down. But yeah, as a general rule of thumb, they've gone up. If you were to say 10 years ago, a logging rate might be $25 for a particular setting. Now it's 35 plus. So again, it's part of that, talk about better production equals lower cost. What we've seen is the onset of mechanisation. So pretty much everything is mechanically felled on the whole in sort of small to medium scale forestry, not talking the 1 or 2 Dad and Dave operations, man crew kind of thing, but on the whole, everything's mechanically felled. So you're bringing in a felling machine, and then in most cases, the land is really steep around here. So you've got a winch attached to that, which is letting that felling machine up and down the hill. And the cost of those machines has just gone through the roof in the last couple of years, not only in terms of purchasing costs, but in terms of servicing. Some of our sites, say DC equipment in Wakefield, they might charge as a servicing agent, they'll charge travel to some sites, and it might be an hour and a half down the way to get there. And they'll take 2 guys out to site, they'll take their truck, and the guys are charged at $140 an hour. So, yeah, but just even going to site and returning, you know, you're out of change, out of pocket by $1,000. So the costs, you know, they've gone crazy, but I think we'll continue to see that being pulled back a little bit because there's just not as much cream in it for everyone. So everyone's got to be smarter about what they're doing and just save where they can.
So on that photo before, where you
Yep.
were looking down that gully, yeah, there.
There, yep.
Yeah, would that have required tethered winch?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And so what?
So that's in Kingston Forest, just behind Richmond.
Oh, okay.
And that's sort of like
Yeah.
getting up to that 40 degrees sort of thing. Yeah.
So what would I be paying a day or a week or whatever for the harvesting part?
For that particular crew configuration, they're about $13,500 a day.
Oh, that includes the hauler?
Yeah.
Without the hauler though?
Without the hauler, you take about $3,000 off that.
10 grand a day?
Yeah.
Right.
But with this crew, without the hauler, they'd have to throw on a skidder to do any production otherwise. So then you're up to 11.5, 12 grand sort of thing.
Yeah, but compared to the old days when you had manual felling happening.
Yeah, but again,
you wouldn't be spending 10 grand a day.
You wouldn't, but your production wouldn't be as high either. So
does that relate to that on that site there? You know, it might have been $38 a tonne.
Yeah, so it's more than that. Yeah, definitely.
The extraction costs, is it?
For the cost on
because it was a steep
on
site,
track.
it might have been $42 a tonne.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah.
Because essentially that's what it's always got to come back to. You can say, well, this is the cost per day, but it's
Yes,
actually
but per tonne. So that's what I'm saying. We would gone with
how many tonnes do they get
how many
out
tonnes
per day?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would they been doing up there? 400 tonne a day?
On that site, because of the sensitivity of it being the backdrop of Richmond, not quite. There's a bit of leniency in keeping that, making sure they did a good job. So that we flew the lines with the helicopter over to the hill over this side, to save any issues with that native gully down the bottom. So the ropes were flying over and they didn't drop the ropes within that. But they could, in other settings, they would do 400 tonnes a day. So, so you bring that back and it actually becomes a reasonable harvest rate. But then it becomes that thing on the other foot where if they're not doing those tonnes, then they're really expensive. And sometimes you don't want those tonnes because the market crashes. There's only so much you can sell to the local mills. So I'll Craig will touch on it, but I'll mention as well, like with the local mills, we've got 2 main forestry companies in the region, 141 and Tasman Pine, and they have all of the local mills could probably get all of their supply from those 2 companies if they need it, but they like to have the turn on with other companies because they can get a better product on the whole by doing that. So smaller woodlots might produce better wood in this situation or whatever it may be, but they've got such a large portion of the market that you can't just squeeze in that extra job if you need to. You might be able to plan ahead, but yeah, as a small forest owner, you're really pushing in a small portion of that market share. That's probably what I'm getting.
And has that been photoshopped to get rid of all the slash?
No, that was actually pretty clean face. But
yeah, good job.
Yeah.
Are they using fixed head?
That was a fixed head. Yeah. Carry on anyway. So, as mentioned, sort of harvesting responsibilities, low quality, environmental health and safety compliance. Again, this goes back to planning, production monitoring, and then logistics. So that's the key point. I kind of spoke with Craig at a few days ago and said he was going to cover off marketing in a different sort of thing, but then it's so intricately linked with harvest management that I've got to touch on a couple of things. So if you look at that skid site there, that's one that's been harvested at the moment. you look at the processing machine there, he's got full stems beside him, but the number of different lengths within that circle that he's cutting around him is basically the number of different grades, which then go in the stack. So you see the logs and their different lengths and different sort of parcels are all different grades going to different customers. So there's a swath of different things you can cut from one particular site. And so you've got to jump into the marketing of it. So we're really, really lucky in this region to have a lot of domestic processing options. For radiata pine and Douglas fir, there's some options for other species as well, but on the whole, these are sort of the bulk of things. So Nelson pine take LVL logs to produce LVL. There's a few prune sawmills, there's gold pine taking posts. So most of the different parts of the tree, from when it's big at the butt to the top of the tree, when it's small as a post or a piece of chip, it can be sold domestically. So we're really, really lucky on that front. So it's a good region to be a small forest owner. But, and you look at this here, I kind of haven't taken prices off just because of sensitivity, but it's a bit of a comparison of saw log versus export. So it's a S25 equivalent comparison of the price over the last few years back to May 22, and the consistency of that domestic price versus the teeth of the export price continuing to go up and down. So as a small forest owner, one of the big considerations is when do you harvest, and to some extent you're at the mercy of when you can get the crew availability. But at the moment, with how much it jumps up and down, it's really hard to pick when the time is right. If you're harvesting in February 23, you'd be pretty happy, but if you're harvesting a month later, you'd be a little bit sad. So it's a pretty key consideration with harvesting and what you can do. And so as I said, the last couple of years, it's pretty depressed on the whole, but it's been up and down a lot.
If we were, like 90% of our logs, export logs, go to China, 10% go to the rest of the world.
Yep.
If we had more markets, if we developed more markets, would that smooth out that line?
Potentially, yeah.
Why aren't we doing that?
Well, I suppose in essence, no one's telling us they want their timber or they want our timber. But we are developing other markets. India's come back on board, but there's only so much capacity there. We're competing with Uruguay and other South American countries, or Chile as well. But with their product, which they prefer New Zealand radiata, but yeah,
to Chilean one.
To Uruguay. Slash pine, I think it is. But yeah, there's the other markets will open up, and classic commodity forestry will go really high again, and then it will come back down. It's a commodity. It's what's going to happen. So you've got to ride the highs and lows of it. So we had a really settled period between 16 and 19, but for the rest of the time, it's been crazy. So. And then there's prune. So prune domestic price again stay pretty constant, but export prices come up and down. And then the final thing, sort of harvest management, is just post-harvest operations. So big thing, water controls in place, slash below 3 meters in height on stable ground. So working on every skid to, if anything's over the bank, pull it back up, and that the site's left in a tidy condition. Important part about all forestry really is that site complies with local rules and NES CF, and that you, at the end of the day, get the sign off from local compliance officer. Really lucky to have a good compliance officer in this region that will work with you along the whole way. So you'll come to site prior to harvesting, during harvesting, and give the sign off at the end. So you know where you're sitting the whole way.
Is the compliance officer a Tasman District Council employee?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Warren Dalvin.
Okay.
Yeah. He's pretty good. He focuses on the big picture rather than the small. Yeah.
But pulling the slash back on the skid site,
Yep.
can you sell it off as fuel wood or?
you can't really sell it, no one really pays for it. They'll take it sort of at a cost neutral sort of arrangement. But even then, it's pretty hard work, I'd say. Worked with main market at the moment for that is the Aswood. And they'll take it back to the yard and they'll pull out the bigger wood and use that for whatever it may be, and they use the rest for landscaping and all sorts. But in theory, it's really good, but it's in practice, they've got the market share, and they can dictate things on their terms. So it is good to have that, but it's probably easier to just pull it up onto the skid and let it rot in most situations. And they've also got about a 30k as a crow fly radius is around down the yard in Brightwater. So anything over this, even here, would be too far away for them to cart. So
what the slash management guidelines that came out specified the 2 meters 10 centimeter, 2 meters long.
Yes, and orange and red zone land. Yeah.
Yeah. How is that affecting your harvesting operations and your bottom line?
Hasn't really at this stage. Yep. Yeah, because it's in orange and red zone land, which you're pretty wary of anyway when you're harvesting there. But we've done some surveying and developing methods for assessing that. So with drone flying methods and using AI to count things, and it's not perfect, but it gives you an idea. And so one job we've had was the maximum is 15 cube per hectare, and we've had one that was about 9. So
that was the highest one.
That was just a job that we did measure. So and it's even within that, you don't know, it's meant to be wood that's sound, whereas windthrow doesn't count if it's dozy and you can't pick it up and it breaks or whatever it may be. So yeah. Cool. Questions? Talk to you in 20 years' time. 30.
Who owns PF Olsen?
Basically the shareholders, there's two different shareholdings. So one of them's the name's Quayside Investments, which is kind of the holding thing for Port of Tauranga, or the whole Tauranga, or Peninsula District Council. Yeah, sorry. It's must be late at night. And then the other ones are basically staff and ex-staff. So
a private.
Yeah. Predominantly, it's just ex-staff because the company is about 52 years old, and so it's the ones that kind of got in early and have grown that larger shareholding over time. So
yeah. I was just wondering, you might be able to shed some light on it. I've just recently done a road trip through the far north, and I was struck by the number of over-mature pine stands dotting the landscape up there, and I'm wondering whether you could throw any light on the reason behind that. I mean, down here, we let them get to 25, 30 years and they're going to get harvested by March, but not up there, you know.
Every region's different. Not sure. Could be if you're going right to the far north, could be distant from market because it's a long way to anywhere from there. But not sure. Yeah.
There are still some pockets of over mature pine use that don't really see a lot around here. Over the last sort of 4 years, I've done a lot of manual tree pulling, like up the dart along the Peka, and out the back of Marahu. Some of that's just been, well, I think the last of what is harvestable in there has just been harvested, and the other pieces have been drilled and poisoned, but can't, you know. So there is still pockets around. That's usually in, you know, that hard country that.
Well, this was on what I generally regarded reasonably easy topography, you know, and it was just a feature of the landscape. These probably like 40, 50-year-old pine stands.
Are they sort of quite smaller?
Small branch size and.
No, but the
small
blocks or because there is more cultural sites in the north.
These were like ranged in size from probably 10 hex to,
Yeah,
sort of, 200 hex.
yeah.
Yeah. Can't say sorry, we digress anyway. So, cool. Thank you very much.
So I've been asked to cover off on log marketing, so I'll just, no, that's all right, that's all right. So I'll just sort of try and focus on some areas that Josh didn't cover, and it's probably like we've talked about, there's two key parts. So and fortunately, we've got a really good, well-established domestic processing industry here for radiata and Douglas fir in particular. So I suppose the one thing with the domestic market is for those high value grades, particularly pruned and poles, they are the highest value returns for those better quality grades. So it's a little bit different to a lot of our primary industry. So our very best quality wood gets processed here. Some other regions in New Zealand aren't as lucky as that, but in Nelson that's the case. Lower price volatility than export. One thing I would say, like the domestic business is based on long-term relationships. So like we've been dealing with those domestic customers for decades, and it's about having long-term supply and providing them with a quality of log that they can make some money out of. So there's a lot of people sort of think, the guy on the skid, when I started, you're doing a bit of log making, you're trying to squeeze everything you could out of that deck of logs to the point, push the spec. But in the long term, we actually need to supply those domestic customers with good quality wood that they can actually make some money out of. So, if you push a whole lot of low quality wood into a sawmill, that relationship isn't going to last for it's going to be sort of one-off stuff. So it's not about it's about giving them good quality and providing them with volume over ongoing. So that's where companies like PF Olsen and Forest Management, we are supplying the domestic mills throughout the year, and so it's about us bring that composite of volume from our small, medium, large forest owners that we work with to provide that balance. So you can't rock up to a domestic sawmiller and think you're going to put volume in there because it just doesn't work like that, So those sort of long-term personal relationships are pretty key in that side of things. So export. So they sort of go hand in glove. Like there's a whole wide range of grades that our domestic processors don't want. They don't make any money out of. We've tried over the years to process them. We don't make any money out of them. We're not. Our labour costs are just too high to really do it as cost effectively as some other developing economies. So they can take like. Rough grades, so your ones with your bigger knots, your short lengths, your small diameter. They can also take the wood that our domestic processors want, so there's a balance there. And at times when the export market's going well, there will be times when those, for example, those export prices will be higher than domestic prices. So it's really important to have an agreed strategy with your forest owner how you're going to handle that situation. It's not sort of go, turn around 3 months into the harvest and go, oh, I didn't realise, when the price of A grade went up to $145 that you were going to still supply that mill. It might be paying $125 a tonne. So you need to understand what the marketing strategy is. So it's like a lot of things. It's a trade-off between that risk and the roll of the dice of taking the spot price on the day versus that more consistent. And often the best way is a sort of combined optimal marketing strategy. You want that full range of domestic and export options, and one thing in, one thing in our industry, things change all the time, and you really, you need to have options when things change, because if you're sitting there going, well, for example, this next month, East Valley's not taking a stick in December. They're basically taking 6 weeks out because the amount of framing timber's starting to build in New Zealand. They've made a call of that. If you don't have an option for that, an outlet for that volume, it's not going to work very well. So, but that's just normal stuff. Like that's sort of not normally that particular thing, but there's all sorts of those sorts of things. We'll get situations where we might get a hold up at the port with not enough space to take logs, so you might be shut out for a particular exporter for a period of time. You can have breakdowns at mills. So it's probably no different to a lot of primary industry. So you've got to have that ability to alter the plan. And one thing I've sort of thinking about this, like the test of your marketing is when things get tough, not when it's going. Anyone can sell logs when things are rocking along. It's a piece of cake. So when things get tough, when you actually work out how good or how bad the company you've partnered with is. So I'll keep it pretty brief. So any other questions on the log marketing side of things?
Are you working on sort of like how the market's developing for some of the minor species that are sort of coming in vogue for planting at the moment?
Yeah, real good question. And I'm going to talk about replanting next, and we're going to cover off some of those alternative species. But that's an area we haven't, as a sector, probably put enough focus into. We've got our industry started particularly with that drive from the Forest Service, and there was a proportion, I think it was, Eric, was it 20% had to be in alternative species? And so we've tried a whole range of different species, and because radiata sort of on a wide range of sites stood out to be the most productive, and it's also proven to be it's really versatile, for a whole range of processing things. A lot of the focus has gone into radiata, and some of the early plantings, some of those species were probably not focused on enough because of some of the way it was managed, some of the weed control tools we have today. There's a lot more opportunity to get those alternative species away. So there is some other sort of bright lights showing through, but we haven't really, as a sector, put a lot of sort of combined effort into it, I have to say. So we might even cover off on some of those when we go into the next section. Has anyone else got any questions about log market?
What prices are you getting from your domestic customers?
It's illegal for us to actually discuss that in New Zealand, so yeah. We don't mind as long as we get $2 or $3 more than Olsen's. That's all we ask.
But is there a formula? Like a gentleman here earlier tonight said to me that when he sold a piece of forest, that it was basically 30-30-30, that he got roughly 30%, that
the logger got 30%. Yeah. So I'd say no. It's really specific on the block. You can have a block of trees, that if it's on rolling flat land, you might be paying nowadays. So we're talking about private woodlot stuff. You might be paying probably as low as what you'd be paying for logging. It'd be in the $30 a tonne. But on an area that's steeper, you could be paying over $50 a tonne to log that. So you're talking about or you could be paying double what it is to log it. And then in the cartage, from around here, you're probably looking at an average cart of about sort of $17 a tonne from where we're sitting here to with your South and Murchison up over $30. So there's not really those sort of rules of thumb. So you can't sort of, yeah, and it's really specific on the block, yeah. And then you're getting into roading costs, which can, go from, $4 a tonne to, $20 a tonne on a real tough site. So hard, yeah.
The topography was either biggest factor apart from distance to Port or Mill.
You're probably right.
Yeah.
There's a website, I just can't quite remember it. You can go on, it's a government like sponsored free website. You can go on there and you can say, I'll have a skid site here, and this is, it comes up with a map of New Zealand, and you find your property and you can get this ballpark figure of what you'll get if you harvest it.
It's called Tree Farmer.
Tree Farmer, yeah. You use that.
Sitting on the Forest Growth Research website, and you just Google Tree Farmer.
Yeah, no, we don't use that because that's just our sort of bread and butter.
I like to do that, Tree Farmer.
Yeah, no, it's good thing. So that would provide some, particularly because it provides that location.
Yeah.
So then that will take into account the cartage and also some of the regional factors. Yeah.
And is there a website that tells you like log pricing across species?
So MPI used to publish log prices. I think they stopped doing that. But if you go on, like, so for example, PF Olsen provide a good newsletter which provides a but yeah, so there is, like, for example, a lot of the log pricing is we use an A grade or a 30 centimetre unpruned log that goes predominantly across the wharf to China as a sort of a baseline price, and from there's a price above and below that. So that's largely when we talk about, when we talk about export pricing. So often there'll be a graph and it'll show an A grade price, which provides an estimate of what the export log market's doing. Yeah.
The farm forestry mag occasionally produces some prices.
Yeah, offshore species prices, yeah.
Yeah, and Alan Laurie used to report on cypress prices as well. But I'm not sure if that's still, he's stopped doing that. Someone else is writing up now, the cypress prices, but that's the only other one other than mine that was in that article,
Well, we might move on to re-establishing your forest after harvest. So, like matching the species to the site is an important thing, and so like the success of the previous rotation is a good gauge of whether that's going to be the right thing to do next time around. So you might have suffered things like wind throws, snow damage, and so that's some of the key considerations. So when you're looking at it, you're looking at the financial returns, but also potentially other considerations like soil stabilisation. We've talked about sediment earlier, and also the funds available, the particular forest owner, how much funds have you got available for establishment and ongoing tending? So, and then your appetite for risk. So, and by that I mean, like, some species, there's the potential for a higher return, but the market may not be as developed. The potential to grow a good stand may be higher. So, what's your appetite for risk? And in a lot of situations, you may get a situation where you have a bit of a mix of so I'm not talking about necessarily mixed species stands, but you might, this particular example here, we've got previously a radiata pine stand planted up at Maraho Forest, and there was significant issues with erosion up there. We've increased the setbacks, so the areas that haven't been planted, and then we've enhanced those areas that haven't been planted by replanting in Manuka. So we've still stuck with a radiata pine replant, largely in that situation around, one of the key factors was the cost and the competition against weeds, as well as the developed market. And then some of these areas here, that's an area of established native, and then we've enhanced that by some enhancement planting around it.
When you look at these setbacks, can you plant these species that you're leaving in supposedly permanently to keep the fresh water clean and all that? Does a setback apply to the Motueka?
No, so it doesn't.
So you can plant it.
You can plant that. Same goes with, for example, where we are doing some work with planting poplars to act as a natural slash trap. You're actually allowed to plant that within the setback.
How about redwood? I've heard some of that.
So it depends why it's being planted. If it's being planted with a view to harvest, then the NESCF rules apply. So you'd require to be not within 5 meters either side. If it's less than 3 meter stream, if it's a greater than 3 meter stream, then it's 10 meters either side. But if it's planted for erosion stability or that, then there is the ability to plant within the setback.
What was it going that with your Motueka there? That was what, a couple of years ago that you put that in? More than that?
No, that was some of that stuff. That's coming up 4 years. Yeah.
And so how's that doing up there?
It's going well. I mean, it's a very good growing site. You know, it grows everything. It grows weeds like hell, but it grows good trees. But they're very vigorous. So we're planting root trainers, which are they come away very vigorously, and we've had good success, good survival rates. So the key is getting the good, particularly the pre-plant spray. One of the challenges we've got, and you can pick up a few here if you've got eagle eyes, but in those areas, those riparian areas, is you can see the odd bit of regen pine which is cropping up through. So controlling that regen pine within those riparian areas is a really critical thing. And that's a bit of a balance when you know, we can't get chemical in a stream. We don't want to, but we also want to be spraying as close as we can to that stream to pick up as much of that regen pine as we can. And then what we've got is an operation the spring following planting, so 1 and a bit years on, where we do go in and do a bit of regen pulling and using hoppers to pick some of that late germinating regen or regen we haven't picked up.
Walking through it.
Yeah. Tough job.
Yeah.
So just talking about other considerations, we've talked about the increased setbacks. So that's over and above what the NESCF requires. Impact of climate change. This is sort of something it's quite hard to be definitive about, but I think it's something we've got to think about. And like we're getting, you know, greater extremes of climate, and you know, parts of New Zealand, the eastern side, potentially more drier, drought-prone areas, and western side, you know, potentially more wetter. And we're somewhere in the middle of that, but yeah. So I think I like being working in the catchment collective. I think Olivia and their family, you guys are certainly taking that into account with some of your planting, aren't you? With you know, where the climate's going, you know, and how that impacts. And then the other thing is the wilding pine risk of the different species that we're looking at. So as Heather mentioned earlier, we now, with the changes to the NESCF, we're required to do a notification to council for replanting as well as new planting, which is change. And as part of that, we've got to do a wildling pine risk assessment. So that does particularly impact on Douglas fir. So, you know, it has been, you know, it's a really favoured framing timber, great history in New Zealand, but there's a lot of parts of New Zealand now where you can't plant Douglas fir or even replant what it was previously Douglas fir because of that wildling pine risk, particularly where you've got the risk of that seed blowing onto open areas or areas of national park, something like that. Just looking at, so here, I'm not trying to, you know, this isn't an exhaustive list by anything, but just some key, suppose, when we're looking at what species we're replanting, like radiata pine. One of its key features is it performs well on a wide range of sites. Hybrid pines I thought was worthy of mention. So on a lot of those areas that were previously more suited to Douglas fir, there's quite a lot of hybrid pines being planted. So that's Pinus attenuata, radiata pine crossbreed. So they are, because of the wilding pine risk, but also their growth rates being higher than Douglas fir, they are proving to be popular in some parts of New Zealand, particularly further south.
One of the reasons that it is being planted, the hybrid is a closed pine, a closed cone pine, in which case the cone will only open after a fire. It won't open in the heat of summer. So it remains closed on the tree, and that's why part of the reason that it's being planted, but it's also much more tolerant of snow as well.
Yeah. And Appleton's are supplying those. You're supplying quite a lot of those further south, aren't you? Like some big. But how many hybrids? Do you know off the top of your head how many hybrids did you do last season?
I don't know.
I think it's significant amount of seedlings. Yeah.
There's also noting that research on some of these things like Douglas fir, with change to the ability to engineer some of those species so that they don't become wilding species. So yeah, so not there now, but that's part of that raw change around genetic modification, is looking at species changes.
Yeah.
One of the companies on the southern half of the island is aerially spraying the Douglas fir with a weak solution of Roundup at the time that the young Douglas fir flowers are on the tree, and they're killing the flowers. That's a technique that I've heard about recently.
Yeah, right. I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
Did you have to do that every season?
Every season.
As in the redwoods here, is sempervirens and gigantea come under that?
Yeah, so we've our company's actually planted the largest dawn redwoods, as we call them. So
dawn redwoods.
Yeah. So quite a large block for a.
It's a Chinese tree.
That's a Chinese one.
Oh, sorry, I'm talking about the. I got that right here. What's the
Californian coastal one is
sempervirens.
Yeah, not sempervirens.
The giant.
Yeah, I'm talking about giant redwood.
Okay, that's the high altitude one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But normally we're talking about coastal redwoods or sempervirens is what we're talking about. But there is some interest. So it'll be interesting to see how the giant redwoods go.
Where you plant it? Can you tell us where you plant it? Not specifically.
It's down in inland from Oamaru.
Yeah, we've done some in Pukaki way.
Yeah. So redwoods are looking like arguably like, and I'm a redwood fan, so but they're arguably probably looking like they're probably the second species as far as amount of area, heading towards that. There's some really good opportunities. Magnificent tree, you get a great forest out of it, and there's some the high value market, particularly at this stage in California, for people that have built houses out of redwoods, but they cannot do any renovations or anything out of locally grown redwood because it's all locked up. So there's particularly some high value returns for clear redwood in California, but we really want to be processing that in New Zealand. That's the key to really making a good return out of it. And probably NZ Redwood Company have just recently sold, going through OIO at the moment, The family that was behind that originally did have plans to build a processing facility in New Zealand. I think under the current ownership, the new ownership, that's possibly less likely. So, but there's other people growing redwood resources around New Zealand. So there's definitely some good opportunities there. Quite a significantly higher cost to establish, and also higher costs when you're looking at pruning redwoods. And the sort of school of thought at this stage is to get those high returns. Pruning redwoods is the way to go. So, yeah.
Does it have sorry, also does it have an advantage being a coppice species in terms of like erosion control?
Yeah,
but also
yeah, for sure.
You know, regrowing a second rotation.
Yeah, so you're getting, there's a few things there. So with redwoods, they grow a sort of a network of roots. And then so that's great for holding erodible soil together, but also when they're harvested and felled, they do coppice. So you don't, with one of the things with radiata pine is when you fell it, the stump is dying. So over a period of time, if you get a rainfall event, it's more likely to wash out that root ball and all, whereas you've got a live root structure still there that's coppicing, you don't have that same risk, which is the same as some of the eucalypt species as well.
Is there something being done with the big log left over when you take a pruned butt off a redwood?
Yeah, so I mean, I've used unpruned redwood in my own house that was processed here locally, and it's 10 years old and appears to be doing well at this stage.
Is exterior cladding?
Yeah, exterior cladding, much in the way of Western red cedar type. It's similar. The conversion for the sawmiller wasn't great. There's quite a lot of dead black knot that drops out. So that's one of the challenges with unpruned redwood. But it's a great product. Like I think looks good, you know, but granted, we haven't got it actually in full sunlight, this bit. It's sort of under, so I think there's some great opportunities there. But it's yeah, some of the early stuff that was milled, the results were quite variable between different trees. So there was sort of and some of the early results of unpruned redwood processing weren't great. But yeah, so there's still plenty of work to be done there.
Why are the costs higher for pruning redwoods?
Because of the number of small branches, and because of their they come back with when they're under stress, they put out those epicormic roots and that, which so, and also one thing about like a radiata pine, it's like you hit it hard when you're pruning, they seem to, it's really hard to knock them back, whereas with redwoods, you've got to cut the more green crown. So you can't prune up as high in each lift. So you've got to do more effectively, you know, you should be able to get up to, 6 meters in 2 lifts with radiata if you get that timing right. But with redwoods, that would be challenging to do. You're more likely to, be sort of 3 lifts or even 4 lifts.
So to get contractors in to do that, it's quite a bit more cost.
Yeah, or if you do it yourself, a lot more time.
Yeah. That depends the size of the stand, doesn't it?
True. Yeah. So I mean, personally, I think in some situations, like for myself, an ideal scenario might be you might have some redwoods, for example, in an area that is well planned that you can harvest at a later date, but then you might have some radiata pine. You might have some, you might do some sort of native enhancement planting or stepping back from those waterways a bit further. So then moving on to the eucalypts, there's been a lot of work with the New Zealand Dryland Forest Initiative on durable eucalypt species. Unfortunately, it's probably suffering from I don't want to start Roger off on this, but it's probably struggling with a bit of funding, like at the moment. So but if you're interested in looking at eucalypts as an option, there's a lot of information available there. And so there's certainly some potential. One of the big things which has been, you know, a lot of the eucalypt stands that have been planted, because they're frost tolerant, being Nitons, which have got very little value as a generalization. So people have become, you know, species is really important. And one thing with eucalypts is, you know, that initial weed control is just critical to get that right. They will just sulk if you don't get the weed control right. The cypress species, there's, you know, some magnificent timber produced, and that there has been some really disappointed forest owners with some of their returns from cypress. A lot of it's due to canker, but also where there's the exposure to wind, that seems to be a real negative. So it needs to be in the right site. It needs to really be well sited, in my opinion. And then there's some other, you know, talking on a more higher input, but also potentially higher return. There's some good opportunities with oaks, and Appletons would be the best nursery in New Zealand for buying oaks. So there's a lot of that sort of material. You guys are selling that to other parts of the country. You know, I remember when I was working in Gisborne, we were buying seedlings from Appleton's nursery, bringing them all the way up there, you know, because that's the place where you get the seedlings. So we're really fortunate to have that, particularly for some of these alternative species, as well as radiata. We got you know, a really great nursery right on our doorstep. So I won't linger on too many of these, but as far as the options for re-establishing a native for plantation, but looking at timber here, I think probably Totara stands out as being one of the real key species, which is you know, being tolerant to a wide range of sites, but also, you know, the ability to grow a merchantable log in what's, you know, quite a, you know, not an unrealistic time frame. So yeah, I think, and potentially in that scenario, having a interplanting with either Kānuka or Mānuka, it's probably quite, as a nurse crop with the Totara, is probably quite a good way to go in most situations. So like we're doing a block of 4 or 5 hectares this coming winter, and in a mix, with the view of trying to get a Totara forest, which will be that'll be a really interesting project. And people have, you know, there's been quite a lot of work into actual Totara plantations. There's been work into other species, but I think for our region here, my opinion is that's probably one of the key ones, really.
Yeah, Craig, we're going to get to.
I think you'd be looking at growing them on, say, a 60 to 70 year rotation. Yeah, and in New Zealand, that's sort of like, well, I'm not going to get anything out of that. But you know, in other parts of the world, like Europe and that, people have a real value on forests that are, you know, they might be 20 years old or 30 years old. They're not, just because they might not see the harvesting in their lifetime, they've got more of a value.
Someone's got to start.
And it's a value on the property.
Yeah, and
in terms of your property value of future potential.
What about a redwood in relevance? When are you really looking at logging?
I think in the South Island, I think sort of 40 years. So I think like in the North Island, some of those sites, and that's where a lot of the investment in redwood plantings has sort of moved to, like the King Country and Taranaki and that, because of the growth rates. So I think, in my view, sort of that's what I'm sort of working on, around about 40 years on an average site round here. So
a mile away from Douglas Fair, really, isn't it?
What's that?
It's not
a redwood from a Douglas.
No. Some very similar, yeah.
You're going to be getting what, higher basically area factor off redwood, though, aren't you? So potentially
on the right side, yeah,
right side,
yeah, definitely. And that's the thing with, you've had it on the head, really. Like one thing with redwoods is, like, they can, you know, if you've got them stocked at, say, you know, standing at, say, even 500 stems per hectare, they will keep just pumping volume on. You know, you keep the very wind firm and they'll keep putting volume on. Yeah, and a very long tree.
It's amazing in Canada when you see in some of the parks in Vancouver, and you see massive redwood trees that are this big, and
right
2 meters away there's another one, 2 meters away there's another one.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Is there a political risk if you do native?
As in of not being able to harvest it?
Yeah, because you know how some countries have moved to suddenly clamp down on a particular species and say no more.
I don't think there is for growing them as a plantation. Yeah, I don't believe there is. Yeah.
We have a plan for like a sustainable forest management. You know, you plant it for that purpose and it's registered for that purpose. It's different than what's happening in places overseas. We're going into existing forests and taking it from old growth forests. It's like it's new forests.
Yeah, the Indigenous Forest Unit of MPI down Christchurch and Rotorua. I don't know if they've still got it, but they used to have a register that you could put your planted forest, native forest into, so that it's recorded as a planted forest, so that in the future there's no issue about it having to comply with the Forest Act.
But it's quite specific though. I mean, I know legislation can change it, so it's a real fair enough question because we've seen rules change. But you know, it's allowed for. Like it's, you know, there's no there should be no issues over harvesting your native forest. Yeah. Okay, so just quickly, establishment. So some of the key things to focus on, land preparation. So when we're replanting, that desiccation spray is just critical to get on top of the weeds, but also the regenerating pine, if it is pine. Sometimes there's a requirement for line raking to get good establishment. This particular stand here had quite a lot of, actually had snow damage and wind blow in it, so it had higher amounts of slash, so there was parts of that were line raked. Some of it was tethered line raked, and which is slightly unusual. It's not, I wouldn't, but just sort of horses for courses, really. This next one's probably more around, one thing I would add, when you're looking at replanting in an alternative species on a site that was previously radiata, if you were looking at doing, for example, converting to a redwood forest or that, often it's beneficial to do 2 pre-plant sprays. So leave the land fallow for longer and allow that regen and weeds to germinate again and spray it again. You've got so much more options before the trees get in the ground. Once the trees are in the ground, you're limited with your options. So that's probably something, just something that, and also if you were looking at areas you're converting to native or something like that, like getting on top of that regen in particular that's the cheapest, most efficient time to do it.
What kind of time periods are you talking about between the sprays?
So if you've got your standard, we use that in November cutoff. So anything that's harvested after in November, we will generally roll over one planting season. So say, for example, you would do, if it was harvested in, finished harvesting in October, for example, and you did your standard pre-plant spray in February, March, and then leave it and then spray it the following February, March, or in the spring, depending on the growth. So you'd actually leave it fallow that winter.
Just add something to that with regen and getting that pre-plant spray right. It can create really expensive problems down the track for silviculture, but then also I've been seeing in harvesting where you've had pockets of regen that haven't been managed properly in forests, and then with the way mechanical tethering works, but mechanical harvesters, they often bind around tree stumps to change angle down the ridge. And if the trees are too small, if the region is a problem, they can't wind around, they can lift all the trees over. And so I've ended up having the manual fell sections that have been designated for the machine, but can't be because of the region problem. So it's
Totally agree. And like a lot of the time if a stand's in radiata pine, you don't quite realise how much regen there until you come to thin it, say at age 8 or 9, and then the cost just escalates, doesn't it? When you go to thin, and then if you go, oh, it's going to cost too much, and you don't thin it, then your forest down the track is it can be worthless. So it's really critical. Really critical. A lot of people they see their site and it's like the easiest time to replant it, and they think they're keen and they want to get in and replant it, but it can't stress it enough, really. So fencing is probably it is an issue with re-establishment but particularly with establishment. So keeping stock out is critical, and it's expensive. It's so needs to be well thought through. Pest control, browsing animals. You can animals and hares. They can do a lot of damage in a short period of time. So it's about those regular visits. So you're up there, and if you say, for example, where you've got goats coming out of areas, and you might go up there and you mightn't see a goat, but that's not a wasted trip. Like if you go up there and there's half a dozen goats and they've been sitting in there for a couple of weeks, they can really do a lot of damage. So just vigilance, really. And then coming around to planting, you need to order your seedlings. The likes of Appleton's, we've been firming up our seedling orders. You sowed your seedlings about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and so the orders need to be in before the nursery sows their. That's sort of best practice. There's always those late comers, and you're sort of rolling the dice whether you're going to get seedlings or not. So having a plan and getting your seedlings ordered is really important, and particularly species like redwoods, they sell out, and you'd be very lucky to pick up redwoods if you're not getting in early. Planting, that timing's quite critical. Like just trying to plant in that window. We traditionally have used a window from sort of roughly around that start of June to the end of August. Like to have our planting done over that period, but some of the other species, like some of the native planting and that, delaying it a little bit depending on the season to try to avoid some of those frosts, and even some of the less frost tolerant species like redwoods and stuff, then it's just that timing's quite critical, more critical than radiata pine. But trying to avoid late planting, and when we've had these big planting programs, it has been a bit of a challenge. So just working with people that are well organised, and you need the labour force to really hit it over that window. Stocking, so really just having a plan depending on what species, the initial stocking varies, and then release spraying, either spot spraying or aerial spraying. It's one chance to sort of establish your forest. You want to do it right. One of the probably just add one of the not mistakes, but one of the things people often, when they re-establish and cut over, we do a pre-plant spray which does a really good desiccation and kills all the weeds, and then we plant, and often we don't get a real, this season's a bit different because it's been so wet, so we've had a lot of early germination, and particularly grass, and that's come away But if it's sort of a bit slow to germinate, and then people are like, oh, do I need to do a release spray? And often there'll be just little germination. But from my experience, if you're seeing those weeds germinating, you're better to do that release spray in the spring before it dries out. Because if you wait and then it gets dry, your result of your release spray isn't as good. And then often, yeah, you end up you spend the money anyway, but you're doing it when the weeds are bigger. Whereas if you do it when they're germinating, when the soil moisture content's up, that's what we've found, get a lot better results. Rather than, and particularly chemicals like, we use a lot of Valzine as the sort of chemical that's used for releasing radiated pine. It actually puts, if things get hot, the soil gets hot and the things dry out, it will put a lot more stress on the tree. So yeah, it's just one thing I think there. So that's all I've got. And appreciate I've gone over some of that stuff pretty quickly, but I'm aware of the time. So anyone, is there any questions on the re-establishment side of things or anything else? Cool.